Oh, they brought the give me coffee? Awesome.
Yeah.
So how have the first few weeks of your sabbatical been?
They were good. Now they're a little more stressful. We're going to CRF. Yeah, it's over, I guess.
Well, that was short.
It was a little short. No, it's good. It's good. Just lots going on. So it's a bit more intense than I think a sabbatical is supposed to be.
Yeah. I've never heard anybody describe starting a company as a low intensity experience.
There you have it.
Hey David, man, how are you?
Good. Hey, are you going to be in Mountain View in the first week of August?
Yes, I will be in Mountain View the first week of August. Where are you going to be in the first week of August?
In Mountain View for the first couple of days.
Oh, really? That's cool. Are you going to be visiting Google or
Yeah.
what else is in Mountain View? Yeah,
I'll be visiting Google. I'll send you an email.
Sweet. That's great. Hope it's the weather should be good in August, I would think.
It's the Bay Area. It's pretty consistent.
Yeah. Cool. Is there a math conference at Google?
No, they're doing this Faculty Institute for their cloud computing platform.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll go do that and then spend a couple days up in the East Bay and then come back.
Cool. Yeah.
So Serge, you're on.
I believe Serge is here. He confirmed earlier. I think he's muted as well.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted.
Okay, but you're there.
Yeah.
I think we should start, right? So we have David, you're filling in for Charlie? Okay. I'm going to wait for Noah to settle down with them.
Yeah, I'm just plugging in so I don't die all the time.
What's that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's a bittersweet moment for me, actually. This is the fourth of 4 defenses this year. There was Tim, there was Kyle, there was Kevin yesterday, and Sean. And they kind of defined the group culture for the past 5 years. So to see all of them go is kind of, it's sad, but hopefully they'll pass the torch on to the next generation. So Sean came here in 2011 from Toronto. And I remember when he came, he was excited about ray tracing, which he has not done in his time here. Sean is now a leading expert. Yeah, but it was a good thing. It got you in the door. And Sean's now recognized as a leading expert in crowdsourcing and in deep learning. He has stayed in both graphics and vision, publishing in CRF and CVPR. And he's going to talk about his work in that space. So
Sorry about that. Connection dropped.
Okay.
sorry, did we lose you,
We
Serge?
lost Serge for a
No,
second.
I'm back now.
You back?
Yep.
All right. I think
Hopefully
we're...
the live stream will also be a source of redundancy. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending my B exam and PhD thesis defense, which summarizes the work of the last 5 years. So my thesis committee is Kavita Bala, Noah Snavely, Charlie Van Loan, and Serge Belanger is kindly sitting sort of on my shadow. And so these projects have also included joint work with Paul Upchurch, Kavita Bala, and Noah Snavely. So the focus of this talk today is we're going to be talking about how do we understand and recognize concepts in real-world scene? How do we build on the scene understanding problem? And so real-world scenes have a vast array of interesting materials, textures, and surfaces. And so homeowners, for example, think a lot of time about the kinds of materials they put in their home. And so let's consider, for example, one photograph. What are all the different kinds of things you could say or want to recognize about this photograph? So without any conscious effort, you immediately can see that this is a living room. You can understand different objects in the scene. You could draw segmentation masks around them if you're asked to do so. You could segment the scene by material categories. You could recognize that the chair is made out of plastic, for example. You have some sort of 3D understanding of the approximate depth and organization of objects in the scene. You could draw surface normals on the scene. And you can even say comments about what things look nice together and what things have good style. And so basically, our body of work in the last 5 years is trying to get computers to annotate these kinds of properties on scenes. And so what could you do if you had all of this information? Well, for example, you could explore photo collections online by materials. You could, for example, search for, hey, what scenes have kitchens that contain brushed metal and beige wood cabinets, for example. If you had an understanding of surface reflectance, you could edit scenes. And so you could visualize what does it look like if you swap out light cabinets for dark cabinets in your kitchen. You could, for example, start with an object you're interested in and then find, purely based on the pixels and the stylistic, what you can infer about the style of the image, what are other objects that might be stylistically compatible with it. And so in this space, I'm going to present 5 papers, and I'm going to sort of divide them in 3 categories. And so at the lowest level, I'm going to be talking about intrinsic images, which is the problem with separating surface reflections from shading. At sort of a mid-level of visual abstraction, I'm going to talk about our work in material classification. And then finally, I'm going to talk about our work on product similarity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about object detection. And so first, intrinsic images. So this was presented at SIGGRAPH 2014, and it was work with Kavita and Noah. So what is intrinsic images? So here I'm showing a little cartoon example. Well, this is actually a real photograph. It feels a bit like a cartoon, but it's so this is a problem of separating an image into the effects of what is the sort of the surface texture appearance and what are the shading, which you can think of as sort of like an image encoding of the surface normals and lighting combined together. And so why is this problem hard? If you haven't worked with this problem, it might actually seem like a fairly simple thing to do. So here's an example, a toy image to illustrate the challenge of this. If you were asked to interpret this as a scene and draw it again from a new angle, you probably would draw it like this. You would say, oh, it's some sort of 3D shape. But in fact, what if it was some sort of other case, like maybe it was in fact a painting, or maybe it was someone projecting light on a white surface, or maybe it was an interesting angle of a statue. All of these are possibilities, and if you're trying to work back from an algorithm, it's in fact very difficult to figure out which of these cases it was. And so this, we understand as humans, is the most likely, but it's really difficult to write this down in an algorithm in a very general way and have this work for real scenes. And so when you get away from toy images, it becomes even much harder because problems are even more underdetermined. The materials in real scenes are very complex, and it makes this very difficult to reconstruct. And one of the key things you need in order to make progress is you need a data set that captures this real-world complexity. And so in the year that this was presented, Tom Funkhauser said in his talk, data sets are absolutely key to making progress in any kind of reconstruction problem. And so before we released this paper, this was the data set people were using. This is the entire data set shown on one slide. And so this allowed people to get started. So this was a really great project from MIT. The problem is that if you have an algorithm that works well in this, and then you turn around and use it on your kitchen, there's no reason to believe that it should work, and in fact, often it doesn't work. And so what we need is a data set that represents the real world. So this is our first major contribution. But then how do you collect this data? So looking at this scene, if you wanted to collect in the same way the MIT data set was collected, you might think you have to take a picture, spray paint the whole scene, and then take the picture again, make sure they're pixel aligned, and then divide the two, which is totally impractical, and you could maybe do it for one image, and it would take you a month. So basically, we take a different approach. What we're going to do is we're just going to say, hey, look, you can just look at this scene and as a person say things about it. For example, you can recognize that the reflectance over here is very clearly darker than the reflectance over here on the cabinet. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use this observation and then ask people to make these kinds of judgments 5 million times on the internet. And so we're just going to ask people. So our contributions for this project is first we collected a massive data set using this technique I just described. Then we described an algorithm, which I'm actually not going to mention in this talk because I don't have time. And then finally, we described a benchmark, which allowed people to make progress now for designing algorithms that work in the real world. And so first, a little more about our data set. So to collect this data set, we downloaded 5,000 scenes from Flickr. We then gave it to people on Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a platform for doing small amounts of work for pay. And then we aggregated them all together, and in total, we got 5 million total judgments from people. So what questions should we ask if we're trying to collect data from people? One thing you could try and do is you could try and point at a scene, point at the scene and say, what's the reflectance here? Is it 30%, is this reflecting 30% of the light? Well, that's a nearly impossible task, even for experts. And so, in fact, so what we're going to do is we're going to ask people to compare relative points, and we're going to use their sort of natural understanding of how scenes are typically done, where you understand that these two kinds of yellow paint typically match, and therefore with high confidence, you can say that, in fact, they're the same reflectance. We're also going to ask people about relative reflectance because we find that it's easier for people to reason about reflectance than shading effects. And so this is our task interface. So we ask people, we use the term color instead of reflectance because we're working with novices who are working online. And then we're going to show them 2 points at a time and we're going to ask which one is darker of the two. Or they could say they're about the same. One thing we tried doing is we tried asking people, how confident are you? The problem is that they'd always say, yep, I'm confident, definitely correct. But very often they actually wouldn't be correct. So what we did is at the end, we threw away the confidence information, and instead we asked 5 people the same question for every single question. And then we would use sort of statistics of how people agreed with each other to give us an estimate of confidence, and that turned out to work better. And then finally, if you put this task as shown here online, people will give you overwhelmingly bad data, like 75% bad data. And the problem is that people really just don't understand. So even though people can separate out with surface reflectance, they're not used to doing so. And so we included a mandatory tutorial ahead of time that really instructed people to discount shading effects. And then this combined with asking 5 people at once allowed us to get accurate results. So in total, we collected around 5 million individual judgments. And then because this was replicated by a factor of 5, we aggregated it down, and then we got around 900,000 high confidence judgments. And so here I'm showing the judgments overlaid on a scene. And I'm using this little representation where an equal thickness line means that they judged them to be equal. And then this sort of greater than sign means that they thought that one side was brighter than the other side. And then here I'm showing a confidence map. So blue is high confidence and orange is low confidence. And we repeated this at this sort of approximate sampling rate, meaning that points were spaced reasonably far apart. And we repeated the experiment with points much closer together and found similar results. But then we found having both of them was helpful for doing automatic algorithms because it allows us to understand short range versus long range. And so we collected this for thousands of scenes. And here we're showing some of the scenes. And that's great. But how do we know quantitatively how good this is? You could sort of look at them and say, yeah, that looks reasonable. But we wanted a more quantitative evaluation. So what we did is we came up with this an experiment where we would show the same scene that's lit 2 different ways. And so Ivo, who was one of KB's previous students, had collected this data set. And the question, and basically, if you have the same scene but change the lighting, then the image looks different, but you should get the same answer because the reflectance hasn't changed. And reflectance is an intrinsic property of the scene and not the lighting. And so we did this for 4 different scenes. And then here, what we found is overwhelmingly most of the judgments are consistent, and the ones that were inconsistent had low confidence. And so here I'm going to flip back and forth between the 2 lighting conditions. And you can see a few of the judgments change, but most of them do not. OK, so that was our data set. For the algorithm, I don't have time to describe how it works. It's actually quite hairy to explain. But instead, I'm just going to show you some pretty pictures of this is what, using this data set, we're able to develop a new algorithm. And then this is the kind of results we're able to get using this data set. So here are some example images in our test set. And then this is the reflectance layer that we achieved. And so if you're not used to look at these images, you may not know exactly what to look for. The kinds of things to expect in a reflectance image is that, for example, if it's one color, you should not see the surface variation. So in the input, you see these bumps where the shading changes because the surface normal changes, and these have been smoothed down to reflectance. Or similarly, in here in the shirt, most of the shading has been removed. And so you should expect that all of the shading effects should appear in the bottom row. And for example, where the color changes, you should not see a change. You should not see a large change in the shading because nearby points receive approximately the same shading. So that's sort of an understanding of how. So that's how you read these images. And then finally, we came up with a benchmark, which we have this large data set, but without a metric to evaluate against, you can't really use it for anything. And so the way we're going to measure our error is we have what we're going to call a weighted human disagreement rate. And so what this is basically is, so we had the image, we asked people to make judgments, and that's what I just presented. And then we can also ask an algorithm to decompose the image, and we take just the reflectance layer. And then by thresholding the same points in the image, we can get what was the effective judgments made by the algorithm. And then we measure how often do these two agree. And so the percentage, the fraction of edges that disagree is going to be our measure of error. And then we're going to weight this by confidence. And so what we did is we took the set of all available algorithms at the time, and we benchmarked them against our new data set and our new metric. And then we found, so using this data set, we're able to improve the error. And then one interesting note is that there's still, in fact, a very large gap between what humans are able to achieve and what the best algorithm is able to achieve. And so although we made progress, I think it's very exciting as a platform for future work. And so, so we still have a long way to go.
The 7.5% is just measured on the workers?
Yeah, so the way we got the 7.5% for the humans is you can hold out some people and evaluate them against the other people. So one thing that might make this, in fact, a little bit lower than it should be is the fact that humans are sometimes biased and they make some consistent mistakes occasionally. And so if you're evaluating one human against other humans and they make the same kinds of consistent mistakes, then their error will be lower than an algorithm that may have had a theoretical correct answer. Yeah, so in summary for this paper, so we had a large data set, we had millions of judgments. We proposed an algorithm that I didn't have time to talk about. And then we had a new benchmark that allowed people to make progress. And so since publishing this in 2014, papers have been published in SIGGRAPH and CVPR building on our data set, proposing new and better algorithms. A lot of them are actually, in fact, based on our algorithm. And so here, for example, I'm going to show, here's some applications you can do once you have an algorithm that works really well. So here, this is the same scene, and what these authors have done is inserted an object synthetically into the scenes in a way that looks supposed to look photorealistic and plausible. And the way they're able to do this is because by separating out the shading effects, they can correctly light the objects, and they know how to cast shadows on the wall in the correct intensity. So does anyone have any questions about intrinsic images before I move on? Yeah.
Have you thought about using this data collection methodology for collecting data and segmentation and edge detection algorithms?
Like relative depth? Or you mean, are these the same points?
No, well, I mean, you could ask the same. You could ask exactly the same question.
Yeah, that's an interesting. So,
would that actually?
Yeah. So I mean, my guess is probably Dan Soren and Philip Isola are going to do that very soon because they're extending these judgments to ask about depth, and I think they're looking at more. So they were inspired by the idea of relative judgments, and they were looking into apply it to new problems. But yeah, that's a very good. Yeah, so then the next body of work is material classification. So intrinsic images are at the very, in my opinion, it's sort of at the very lowest level of scene understanding. Lowest level meaning that it's very close to the physics in that you have you're talking about the surface reflectance and the lighting intensity. And the next level up, you can start thinking about sort of human imposed semantics on the world, like what are high level material categories. And so we have two papers in this area. One of them, we collected a large-scale data set of visual appearance, and then the other one, we used it to predict automatically with a new computer vision algorithm. And so this was first a SIGGRAPH paper and then a CVPR paper for the prediction. And so the general problem formulation, here's an example image, is we want to predict the material, and we want to do it for every single pixel in the scene. And so this is what it might look like. This is actually an algorithm output from our CVPR paper. And this was joint work with Paul and Church as well. And so prior to our work, people were using the Flickr material database for material recognition. So this had 1,000 images and roughly 10 categories, and you could get reasonable accuracy by holding out some images on the data set and testing against other images on the data set. The problem is that these images are iconic and artistic, and so they don't actually represent the real world. And if you take a method that was trained on these images and apply it to real world images, like the one I just showed on the previous slide, you actually get very low accuracy. And so, one of the themes in this talk is that in order to classify or recognize or reconstruct objects in the real world, you first need a data set of images that represent the kinds of things you want to do. And so we have a massive data set that we present called Materials in Context Database, or MINC. And so this contains 2 million labeled material patches in the real world. And so this contains a combination of, from an earlier paper called Open Surfaces, and then we added 1.6 more annotations called clicks. And so here I'm showing the form of annotation that we have. So the way we've collected this annotation is that we have these patches, and all we say is that the center of the patch is a particular material, and the rest of the patch is just context that allows you to help decide what the patch is. So first I'm going to talk about Open Surfaces, which is the first piece of this data set. So Open Surfaces is thousands of annotated surfaces that we collected from Flickr photographs via crowdsourcing. And so here, first, we ask people to give us a scene label and to tell us, for example, what is the object category. So here we're focusing on the countertop. And so we did this using crowdsourcing. And then we got people to segment out the material, label the material by saying, what is it? And then also we asked people to match the surface reflectance. And so this gives us like the diffuse specular roughness of this material. And then finally, we asked people to give us a 3D surface normal, which we use to rectify the surface, and this gives us the texture. And so this was actually a very large pipeline of 13 different mechanical Turk interfaces. I don't have time to go through them all. And so instead, I'll show you some results that we collected from this data set. So here are some of the material segmentations that we got. One of the things we found is that a lot of people had sort of this artistic inclination and very much enjoyed drawing segmentations. They spent way more time than they should have given, the wage we're paying them should have dictated that they should spend 6 vertices per object, not 2,000. And so one person we found really liked segmenting hair. And so they came up with all these, I don't know if you can see, but the individual strands of hair are separated out. And to me, we found enough people who felt like you enjoyed contributing to science and high quality segmentations and weren't in it for the money. So this is great, and it's kind of crazy. So with this data set, we collected material segmentations, we named materials, objects, reflectance, textures, and then we released it online on Open Surfaces to cs.cornell.edu. One other note is the segmentation interface was also used by Sung-Yi from Cornell Tech. So MS Coco is a follow-on project. So Coco is totally unrelated to Open Surfaces. Coco is a large data set of objects, objects in context. The reason why I'm mentioning it here is because our interface was also used in MS Coco. And so here I'm showing the list of collaborators. So there's a huge list of collaborators. And I believe that Sung-Yi did most of the crowdsourcing efforts. And so in Coco, they had 91 object categories. And here I'm showing some of the segmentations that they collected. And they did this using our segmentation interface. So segmentation is great. One challenge that we had with Open Surfaces is that we actually left it open for people to decide what to draw shapes around. So we would say, hey, here's an image, draw a rectangle around something with a single material. And so they would give us little squares around bricks and say, oh, these are individual materials. I did it. But really, the problem is that it's very difficult to get people to have both the freedom to draw things around anything in the image and then also to encourage them to draw things around interesting objects. So for the follow-on project, MINC, which was after open surfaces, we changed the way we annotated data by just getting people to click on individual points, which removes the bias that encourages you to draw very simple polygons. So some people will draw very ornate polygons, but then there's a very long tail of people who just draw the simplest thing possible. And so to collect clicks, what we did is first we asked people in a 3-stage pipeline. First stage, does this contain the material? Yes, no. So okay, if it contains the material, where is it? And then they would click on example points. And so they'd say, I think this contains water. If it does, click on where it contains water. And so they would click 3 times, and then it would show them a new image, and then they click 3 times. And so they can very rapidly advance with the image, and we can very cheaply collect material annotations. And then finally, the way we validated this is we'd show someone a new point and not tell them the previous question. And so from scratch, they'd have to say, what material is it? And so they have to pick from a very long list of materials, and if they happen to agree, then we say, aha, okay, now we believe that it's that material. And so this gives us a very cheap way of validating examples. And so then the result was we got over 2 million material samples and over 20 categories. And just as a visual comparison, if this is the Flickr material database size, then this is the size of the data set that we collected, which was a combination of open surfaces and these 2 million additional clicks as part of the main project. OK, so we got all this data. That's great. Let's classify some materials, and let's do it using deep learning. So prior to our paper, the dominant paradigm in deep learning was to take a single image. And so this is an architecture. You might imagine this is the Alexander architecture, for example. And at the output, you give it a single label. You say, this is a cat. And so this works well if you have like an orca whale, and then you want to say, what is it? And then you get a single answer. And so for AlexNet, for example, it would be one of 1,000 categories for the ImageNet data set. Then the question at the time was, how do you extend this to a prediction for every pixel? And so contemporaneously with us, other people had come up with other ways of doing it. For example, the fully convolutional network with Shellhammer and I forget the other one.
It's good enough.
Good enough, OK. So they also have a very similar method. But one of the questions we wanted was we wanted to do material segmentation. We wanted to predict every single pixel. And so we needed a way of extending this on the top in order to have it for every pixel. And so what we're going to do is we're going to split the problem into little patches. And so at training time, we're going to have an individual patch. So someone that clicked at this point and say that's fabric. And then we can extract it out. And then train a convolutional neural network to tell us one of 20 categories, yes, that's fabric. And then we can do this at multiple zoom levels and average the results, which gives us a mixture of context by zooming out and then being able to better recognize the texture by zooming in. And then what we can do is we can slide the neural network along the image and get its answer from every position, and then we can upsample and average to get a final prediction map. And this is the results. And it looks actually a lot more terrible than it is. This is showing for each point the argmax prediction. And so I'll show it shortly how we clean this up to get much more accurate results.
And to clarify, it's 20 categories and the 990 and 792 are the per pixel.
Yeah, so it's 20 categories by 990 width by 792. The width that I don't know. Right, so then one thing you could do is, so this is something that many people have mentioned. So Jan LeCun's group was the first to notice it with overfeed, that you can, when you're doing the slide CNN, you can compute it in such a way that you share the computation so that when you're sliding the neural network along, you reuse most of the work. And so in fact, it's about 20 times more efficient than if you separately cropped out each little patch.
What do you mean by upsample?
Upsample, I mean, we just do a bilinear upsample. So so we just do a bilinear upsampling. So I guess if this was the only thing we're doing, upsampling wouldn't really make sense. But the next slide will add in a piece that makes it more useful. So we have this, right, so we have an argmax prediction, and we've upsampled it. But then the main thing that this gives us is we use a dense conditional random field, which also looks at the image. And then I don't have time to explain how it works. But roughly speaking, it looks at where natural edges are in the image, and then it smears the labels so that the transition happens at high contrast regions in the image. And so this improves the accuracy dramatically. And so the final result we got was 84% mean class accuracy at click locations. And so the click locations are the points where people gave us their answers.
Sean,
Yeah.
can you briefly mention what sort of layers the CRF fixes? Is it tied to particular class labels? Is it
So the CRF, right, so the CRF generally changes the answer mostly around the boundaries. And so if you measure the errors just around the boundaries, you find the biggest improvement. If you measure the total error across the whole image, in fact, numerically, you don't see too much a difference. You typically see like 2% difference in terms of the global mass. And so one of the ways people often evaluate this is they say, what's the prediction just along the boundaries?
Okay. But did you see that it improved performance for certain class labels?
For certain class labels?
Are certain classes harder than others unless you
That's
have
an interesting
exceptional-
question. We didn't break it down by class label. We did look at context by class label, but we didn't look at CRF. That could be an interesting thing to explore. And so here are some examples. So here's sort of to give you a sense of what it looks like before and after the conditional random field. So roughly speaking, it's a little hard to tell, but so for example, this color here represents skin and this represents hair. It gets the gist of everything. It kind of puts a blob in approximately the correct location, but it gets the borders totally wrong. And so the conditional random field is able to take that kind of input and say, aha, by looking at high contrast regions in the image, I can figure out where to change the label transition. Sort of a hand wavy way of explaining what a CRF is. And so here's some more results. And so here, for example, here's an input image, and here are predicted labels. We created a category we called polished stone. We originally tried to have granite and marble as separate categories, but then we found people couldn't separate them. So we couldn't even collect the ground truth for that. So we just collapsed them, several types of stone into polished stone. And then here, for example, is another example. So then what are some of the insights we found from this? Well, one of the things we looked at is understanding what's the patch size. And so you can zoom in more or less. And then we found that for many categories, there's actually a slightly different optimal window size. But for all the categories, it's around 23% of the image. One thing we thought was interesting was that this curve doesn't fall off more sharply. You would expect, so at the very right end, you're actually looking at the entire image. You would expect that it would drop off further. But in fact, you can actually get a pretty good material classifier by just always having it look at the entire image.
Sean, I have a question. I'm confused. And I forget. I probably knew this at some point, but here you say use the right window size. But I thought a few slides back you said you're actually using multiple window sizes at once.
The window right. So the multiple window sizes are very close to each other. Here we're doing a wider sweep of all possible window sizes, like really zooming in like crazy, and then all the way to the extreme end.
But when you say optimal is using 23%.
23%, meaning that if you had a validation set and wanted to understand roughly how much context do you need in a scene on average in order to disambiguate different materials from each other, then you need to look at approximately 23% of the image in order to reliably separate materials. So some categories, like for example, mirrors are the best if you look at as much of the image as possible, because you need to reason about, am I in the reflection or not?
Well, I thought the point you were making earlier is that you don't actually have to choose the window size. You can use multiple ones and stack them together.
Right. That's true.
So is that done in this experiment, or?
No, this was a separate experiment.
I see. So this is if you want to choose a single window size. What is it?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
But one thing that seems a little bit odd is this window size is dependent on the image size, not on the size of the content that you're trying to classify. So if you have a huge piece of
Right. That's true.
granite and a tiny piece of granite, those sizes are like completely independent of that object. So
So
have
one-
you considered interfaces where
one-
users have like radial interfaces to indicate the size of what the technique.
Right. So, well, in open services, we got people to draw material segmentations. So that's a very good point. One thing we do rely on is that these are sort of natural scenes, meaning that people tend to take photos from a reasonable range of distances. And so it's true. If you wanted to solve this problem in all generality, then you need to have first an understanding of how zoomed in am I to objects, and then decouple that from the problem, and then use this sort of approach.
So these scenes were typically room size scenes, and that implies.
So and just following up on the other question. So there's a parameter that basically is saying what the window size is, and you do different scales out of that.
Yes. So if we chose this size, then at test time we would use like this size and this size. You have a little slightly higher and slightly lower.
Did you try what happens if you do a broad range of scales?
Not in this project. For object detection, we've looked at that, and that does help. And so probably if we're to go back and improve on this project more, we could use a wider range of window sizes.
And then just to return my earlier question, is that what you mean by the upsampling, that you're doing higher and lower?
No, upsampling. So generally in convolutional neural networks, inside the network, there's downsampling operations, which means, and there's some sort of translation invariance built in, which means that if you, in fact, shift the input by 1 pixel, then the answer is identical or nearly the same. And so it only makes sense actually to get an output every 32 pixels or so. If you do it at a higher resolution than that, then you'd get a smooth map anyway. And this has to do with the way that neural networks are built typically. People are looking into building neural networks that do better at high resolution prediction. But I would say that's sort of the problem.
Sean, I'm still a little confused on your word of window. What is the size of the image, and where is the user looking at? From where is the user looking at that?
Right. So, well, one way of thinking about it. So these are little squares in an image, and you can a window size. I guess maybe this is also a window here. Window size means that if you took a little square crop of an image,
right,
as a fraction of, I think, the image diagonal.
Okay.
On average, how much of a room scene do you need to see in order to tell
Okay,
me
so
what is the material?
23% is a window size whose either diagonal or size of the square relative to the size of the full image.
Basically, this would mean that the full. So here I'm showing a typical example for a glass where this is showing roughly a quarter.
And so where is the user in looking at that?
So sorry, this window size is actually a machine. It's a computer algorithm, computer vision trying to recognize. So for humans, we did not evaluate how much. So humans always had the full image context.
Is one of the interpretations be that it is doing object detection, and it's?
I have long since I've suspected that. So people know that object detection improves material recognition, and so I think it's a reasonable hypothesis that inside the network is doing object detection.
So object detectors emerge in deep material recognition.
Probably someone should write that paper.
Yeah, we don't know for sure.
Okay.
Right. It's a good question. We meant to answer it. We
I
still
think it
don't
would
have
be
the
likely, yes.
It's hard in all of these.
So yeah, X emerges in Y. There's a few different papers that have that, and so maybe you should have X equals materials, or X equals objects, Y equals materials.
Well, so this sort of analysis here is often, I think, in like attention mechanism papers, where they're trying to do object detection. And so
I would be very surprised if object detection was not naturally emerging inside the network when it gets trained. Okay, so I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Yeah, so some of the other things we found was we did an experiment where what's the accuracy? So on the vertical axis is our test accuracy, and on the horizontal accuracy is how many patches we're using for training our classifier. And one of the things we found, so when we started collecting the data set, we're focusing on sort of natural state statistics, and we're not thinking very strongly about balancing the data set by category. And then after we'd already collected all the data, we went and balanced the category by throwing out most of the data, but keeping all the categories with an equal number of patches per category. And then we found we got a significantly higher accuracy than if you use, for example, the same number of patches but unbalanced. And so the most accurate is still to use all of the data, but if we're going to go, someone's going to collect a new data set, I would say keep balancing in mind from the very beginning.
Sorry, quick question. Did you do data augmentation?
What kind?
Oh, well, okay, so like clipping images or
Sure,
sharing
yeah,
images.
yeah, the standard augmentation.
Okay, because you had click locations, how does that affect the precision of the user's click with respect to what you're
So we extract it to a patch, and then the question is what's the material in the center of the patch, and we do have a
But if
small
you're
amount of
jittering it,
Sure,
the
yeah.
user annotated one particular point, you don't know how big that extent is.
Right. So
how do you
yeah,
jitter it?
augmentation improved the results, yes, and probably that just means that most of the clicks were not right on the boundary, and therefore even if you jitter it a little,
Oh,
it's still
okay, so if you expect, most likely it will not accidentally put the wrong label in the center.
Right.
And did you find that that augmentation affected the balancing of your data set? Because I can imagine if you're like, when you build
that
a new batch, for
that
example,
augmentation
you
doesn't
randomly-
change the balance.
But you could imagine like randomly sampling from your data set without balancing it first, or you could do stratified sampling where you first sample a class level and then you sample and sample. So
Right.
that's
That is how we train it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So then, okay. So then we have, okay. Then the last term we have, the last lesson we have from this project is that one of the things we used is we used these clicks to train the neural network, but then we also had this conditional random field piece, which smooths everything to the boundaries. Or sorry, it snaps everything to the boundaries. And one of the things we found was that if you use the clicks to also train the method that gives you good boundaries, then in fact it doesn't do anything. So here is the CRF that's supposed to improve the visual results, but if you train it on clicks, so the CRF has some internal parameters you need to set, then in fact it makes no change, which means that the clicks weren't close enough to the boundaries, and so by training on them you didn't learn anything. So what we used is we used the full material segmentations from the previous open services project, and then when we used that to set the parameters for the conditional random field, then we found it observed the boundaries correctly. And so I guess the lesson here is that although clicks are much cheaper to collect, you can't actually throw away segmentations. You still have to collect some segmentations, and then you can collect a larger bounty of clicks. So I'm gonna move on because I don't have much time. So okay, so then the last project is we presented at SIGGRAPH last year, and so this is learning visual similarity for product design with convolutional neural networks. And so this is sort of the last piece in what I'm calling the visual hierarchy, or sort of moving up to the highest level of visual abstraction. And so we've talked about intrinsic images, we've talked about material recognition, and sort of the highest level visual thing you can say is that some things are vaguely visually similar to other things. And sort of this is a very abstract notion, and we're going to try and learn this with machine learning. And so the motivation for this project was that there's many different sites online, and people are starting to share millions of interior design ideas and style suggestions. And people spend hours and hours browsing these sites and commenting and you know, liking and sharing photos. And the problem is that you can't get inspired if you can't find things. You're just drowning in images. And the navigation tools that were on the site are just totally insufficient. And so if you look at one of these photos and say, hey, what are people saying about this photo? They will ask questions like, hey, what's the countertop? Who sells the range hood? Who's the manufacturer? They want to buy the items in the photo. And so wouldn't it be great if we could automatically identify the products with no humans involved? And so this project is about automatically answering this question. A related question is, where is it used? And so people are design challenged and they want style suggestions. They want to understand, you know, can you recommend some chairs to go at this table? And then the store owner might reply and say, oh yeah, these chairs go well. But wouldn't it be so much better if instead you could have someone say, sample image of this table, and here's some designer chairs that look nice with it. And so this is another problem that we want to solve using the same technique. And so here's another way of showing the problem. We're going to take a crop, and we're going to ask, we'd like to, given a bounding box, ask, what is this product? What is this thing? And then our system will tell us that this is a Great Bowl of Fire, it's a fire pit, and that you can buy it from John T. Unger, LLC. And then we'd also like to be able to search where was this object used. So starting from this image, we'd like to be able to search across scenes and say, aha, this product is used here and it's used here. And so you can get a sense of, you know, that it can be used as a fireplace or an ornamental torch, for example. And so why is this problem hard? So here are different crops of the same product. And so we can recognize that it's the same product, but in fact, they're very different in their resolution, their color, viewpoint, and lighting. They might be occluded. And so we want to find matches between these kinds of images, which is very challenging in the general case. And so we solve this problem by thinking about two different kinds of images. On the left, we have the iconic images, which are the product images from like the Amazon web store, for example. And on the right are observations of the product in the scene. So you can imagine you've seen it in the scene and you have a known bounding box, and then you crop it out. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take both of these kinds of images and project them into an embedding, which is a high-dimensional space. And so we're going to give it, you know, a vector position. We're going to say how this image projects to this location. And then we're also going to say that these images, because they're the same product, we want them to also project to the same location. And then we want this to project somewhere else because it's a different product. And this to project even further away because it's not only a different product, it's also a different object category. And so if we had this embedding, then we can answer the question, what is it? We can take this crop, we can project it into the embedding, and then we can do a nearest neighbor lookup to recognize that, you know, that it's this, you know, it's the Hemel hanging light from Holly Hunt. Or we could start from this item, we could project in the embedding, and then we can retrieve the nearest neighbors of the in-context images. And then here we can retrieve examples of where was it seen. And so how are we going to obtain this embedding? What we're going to do is we're going to train a neural network. And then I'm going to describe how we gather the training data to train a network, and then I'm going to show you how well does it do. So our approach is we're going to use, I shouldn't say our approach, I should say prior approach. No, this is our approach. Okay, I'm just kidding. Okay, so, sorry. What we're going to do is you can imagine in one piece, we're going to have a piece that extracts features from the image, and this is going to be a deep neural network. And then we're going to attach a piece to the end that projects to an embedding and then outputs an embedding position, which is the same thing I showed in a few slides ago. And then what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this in a box and consider it a single deep neural network, because the neural network consists of a series of layers. So if you add on one more layer, you can just consider it as a bigger box. And so in comes pixels, and then out comes, a 64-dimensional vector, for example. So then you have this neural network. How do you obtain the weights for this neural network? What we're going to do is we're going to take examples, and we're going to start with some random weights. And so the initial weights could be, weights that you get from a totally different task, or you could just put random numbers in there. Both of them work. And we're going to take an in-context image and project it somewhere in the embedding. So initially, to project to the wrong location. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a copy of the neural network that has the same parameters. And then we're going to take another image and project into the embedding. And so these two are the same product, and so you want them to be nearby in the embedding, which initially they're not. And then what we're going to do is we're going to write down a loss function that measures the distance between these two, and then write an optimization problem to minimize the loss, which will pull the points together. And so the gradient of the loss, you can imagine, acts like little forces that pull the points together. And so if you did this, and this is the only kind of thing you did, then what you find is all points collapse to the same point, because all you have are inward forces. And so what we need is we need a second kind of example. We need a negative example. And so here is a different iconic image. And because they're similar, and we've started training this, they might in fact project nearby in the embedding. But we want them to be separated by a certain margin. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up with a margin, which is a hyperparameter you have to cross-validate. So that we actually only need one parameter, which is not too bad. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say that if they're closer than the margin, then we're going to have a loss function that pulls them apart. And so the penalty we pay is essentially the square distance between this point and the margin. And what I'll do in terms of the gradient, it will have the effect of pulling them apart. And then the combination of these two losses together allows us to reorganize the space, so that way eventually, after you do this with many iterations, everything is organized nice in your embedding. And so the training pipeline is we have some image pairs, so I'm going to explain later how we get them. We pass it through stochastic gradient descent, which is a method of minimizing a loss function. And then this will give us the parameters for our neural network. We then take a large image database where we've maybe separately downloaded millions of product images. And then for each image, we can run it through the chronological neural network and project it and look at where was its embedding position. And so we collect all of these embedding positions, and then we can visualize it directly, for example, to see what does it look like. And then later on, I'll show you some visualizations of what does the embedding look like. So this is great. And then how do we collect the training data for this method? So for this project, we were browsing house.com, and we noticed that house has some interesting product tags. And around 2% of the scenes have scenes where the store owner has indicated little labels saying, this product here corresponds to this iconic product, or this object corresponds to this one. And so this was actually, because they have a million images, this turned out to be enough data to learn for our problem. And so then the question is, what is the spatial extent of each tag? Because we need a little bounding box to crop out the different products. And so what we're going to do is we're going to turn to crowdsourcing. So we're going to design a new mechanical Turk interface where we show someone the iconic product, we show someone the product in context, and we're going to ask them to draw a box. And so here's the iconic, the tag in context, and then let's see. And then we show a little animation to guide their attention. And then they're going to first give us a bounding circle, which sets the zoom level. And then they're going to draw 4 lines around the image. And then we found by giving them infinite lines that it was a little bit easier to draw than if we gave them just sort of a standard click and drag interface. And then at the same time, sometimes most of the labels are pretty good, but then sometimes a store owner on Houzz might give us a bad product, or maybe they're trying to spam the site. And so we have this mismatch button where workers can flag images. And so the overall pipeline is we downloaded a bunch of images from Houzz.com and removed near duplicates. We ran it through our crowdsourcing interface in Mechanical Turk. And then what we did is we took all of these images and then we sampled pairs, which we used for training. And we used, so the training was the stochastic gradient descent I mentioned earlier. One other note is that when you're cropping images, so Kevin mentioned earlier data augmentation. It was good to bring up because it's something that's very important. So you don't want to always show the neural network exactly the same image, because then it has a capacity to potentially memorize the answer without really knowing how to generalize to new examples. So one way we can combat that is we're going to first add a little bit of padding. We're always going to add the same amount of padding so the neural network knows how much padding to expect. And then we're going to take random subcrops. We're going to work with the square and then take random subcrops, which artificially makes the problem a little bit harder, but then it prevents the network from just memorizing exactly what the answer was. So now that we've trained our network and used the data, 10 minutes, okay. I'm going to show some results. And so, you set it up, and this takes maybe about a week to train or so on a single GPU. But at running time, it runs in milliseconds. And so for a lot of people, they say, okay, that's good enough. And so here's a visualization of what the embedding looks like. So this embedding is very massive. I think I'm showing about 5% of the total images in this visualization. And so here they're projected in 2D. So the original embedding for this particular one was 64 dimensional. But then you can non-linearly project it down to 2 dimensions using an algorithm called T-SNE and visualize it that way. Or you can take a small subset of the images and project them. And so here I'm looking at just, I think it's 1,000 chair images here. And they might be a little bit too small to see. But one thing that's interesting is even though we didn't tell the network about concepts like leather objects or thin leg objects, in order to perform the task well, it automatically recognized these different attributes about objects and then organized the space this way. So I thought that was really cool. So these are letters. So these are labels that after the fact I have imposed on the problem and say, aha, I learned something more than just product implications. And so here's some results of our method. So here is an example crop in an image where we might want to ask, what is it? We could also start from a product and say, where is it used? We could also use our embedding to understand what objects are near other objects and potentially use it for some sort of similarity search. And then we can also quantitatively evaluate, like, for example, what is the recall performance of this? And so here's an example of a chair in context. And so this translucent objects are sort of traditionally challenging for computer vision because the foreground and background are blended together. And so here I'm showing the results. This is the iconic chair. So a Houzz user had labeled this image and said, OK, this is the correct match for this chair. And then this is what our algorithm wrote. Our algorithm, these are the nearest neighbors in the embedding for our algorithm. And so you can find that it found many translucent chairs, and I would argue that the top match it found is closer than what the product store had labeled. There's a lot of redundancy in the data set. And so here's another example. Here's an in-context image where a user might crop around this little stool. And the Houzz user said, this is the exact stool. And then our algorithm found closer matches than what the Houzz user had written.
I have a question. You said there's redundancy in the data set, but you did remove near duplicates.
Remove near duplicate. Redundancy meaning, yeah, that's true. So we remove
So it's like color variations.
Yeah, it'll be like color variations, and it'll be a separate product. And very often, the owner of the store will label the wrong color, and we might get the correct color. And in our validation set, we might even get penalized for that.
So what does that mean for the train test? Do you have to worry about color variance?
That's a good point. We didn't actually look at that for the train test. We did exclude near duplicates between the training. We totally removed them. So there's no near duplicates between training and test. But for color variation, so it is possible that it trained on like the red version of something and was tested on the blue version.
Is like how much does silhouette play?
So
Some of these
silhouette
are
might
like-
play, probably my guess is it plays a large role in the iconic image, but silhouette you can't really use
Yeah,
in the same image. You have a question over here?
I was just wondering why you can see the story.
This one or the far right? So this is shown in ranked order. So this would be the algorithm's prediction, and this would be its second guess, third guess, fourth guess. So one of the things I didn't have time to mention is, in fact, the neural network is trained with two sources of information. One is which things are close to each other, and then it also has this extra classifier label to say what object category is it. And so sometimes it might get the semantic object category right, but the fine grain totally wrong. So it might map two stools that look totally different together because they're both stools.
Okay, so like if it runs out of things that are similar, then you start structural similarity.
Yeah, I guess you could think of it that way. Yeah, so you can also use this for other uses. So for example, if you hold out some of the boxes and consider them your test set, then you could start from this product image and search over these images and say which of these boxes are the most similar to this image. And so here we're showing sort of, you can think of them as scene detections. They're not true detections in the computer vision sense because a human drew the box, but when we're doing this experiment, we threw away the information of what's inside the box. And so if we wanted to run this for a real world system, we would probably also need a method to draw the boxes for us. This is commonly known as object detection. And then separately, we would want to do the fine grained separation. But for this project, we were interested in object detection, so we separated out the problem. One last thing you can do with the embedding is you can do a search across categories. So you can start with an example in one category. Like here, we're starting with this quilt. And then you can say, what's the closest dining chair in the embedding to this quilt? And these images are a little bit small, but you might notice they all have floral patterns. Or for this image of this stylized chair, it found sort of wooden variations of various objects. And so this doesn't work for a lot of the objects. You kind of need something with an interesting style. So the method was not trained for this task. This is more of an observation that you can do this auxiliary extra task, that you can find things that are stylistically similar just because the neural network learned how to organize things by general visual similarity. And so I think this is very cool and very promising. And I think that if you train this for this task, you might do very well. So how do we evaluate the results? So you can find lots of examples where it looks really cool, but then you might want to know, what was in the list of all the products, what was the rank of the correct iconic image? And so here, for example, we're showing another query, and then the rank of this product maybe wasn't, the correct product was in rank 440, but all of the ones above rank 440 looked, maybe to a person, you would say, yeah, these look like they're in fact the same, or maybe they're knockoffs of the correct answer. And so just one thing to note is that even if the top product is correct in the sense that you can't really distinguish them, the numerical rank may be large. And so with that in mind, we measured plots where we measured the mean recall for different sizes of ranks. And so basically, for this, you want to be up and to the left. And so this is our algorithm. State of the arts at the time for this kinds of problems. And then random guessing runs to the bottom. So we do very well. In fact, numerically, we get about a 2x improvement over the baseline. And then so I mentioned that we have this extra task training with categories, but we didn't have time to describe exactly. But this gives us a fairly good improvement. And the one other thing you can do is you can L2 normalize your embedding. So when I described the embedding, I thought of it as just this general vector space. But in fact, if you project it to constrain it to be on there, then it turns out the optimization problem becomes a little bit easier and the performs better. So for this project, we had our contributions where we introduced a method of asking what is it and where is it used. And so we had this crowdsource pipeline to correct image pairs. We used deep learning to learn the high quality embedding. And then we had applications in interior design and product search. And so one last piece I want to talk about is this problem of who draws the boxes, or how do we get boxes? So in this paper, we had humans draw the boxes, and then we threw information. We just pretend we didn't know what's inside the box. But if you really want this to work, you need a method of detecting objects. And so I'm going to quickly describe a recent CVPR paper called ION. And this started out at a Microsoft research internship with Krishik and Larry Sitnik. They've both since left to Facebook AI Research. And then Kavita was also on the paper. And so in summary, so this is sort of the whole project on one side. It's cover it very quickly. We competed in the MS GoPro detection challenge, which is sort of the new big challenge that everybody in object detection is competing in, and then we won best student entry. So as part of this challenge, we had a new detector architecture, but then what people tend to find in these challenges is, in fact, the person with the best architecture doesn't necessarily win. Very often has the best method of augmenting their data and using lots of scales and using many ensembles together. Or they've come up with little tricks for training and testing. And so numerically, if you add together how many points do you get for each of these kinds of contributions, you tend to get, so for example, the winner, so we didn't win this competition, but the winner for their piece, their detector, they got about 6 points for their detector. And so these other points end up sometimes determining who wins. And so just to give a little background, the state of the art in object detection at the time was a method called fast RCNN. So basically, I'm just going to cover this very quickly. Basically, fast RCNN considers a bunch of candidate regions in an image, and then for each region, you want to say, is this an object? Yes, no. And so imagine there's some proposal method that's giving you candidate regions. And then for each region, the way you do it is you run it through a deep convolutional neural network, and you get this feature map. So you can imagine this might be like 60 across 60 high, and then have some 512 channels deep. And then you want to crop out some region, use the method of resizing it down to a fixed square, and then you give it to several fully connected layers, and then you finally get a classification score at the end. So people often think of this first piece as feature extraction, which is a bunch of convolutions and max poolings and downsamplings, and then these last pieces as the classification layer. And so for this project, the main thing we wanted to do is to say, can we improve on feature extraction? And so there's a few problems, like, for example, small objects might get upsampled, and also you're not using any context. And so for this project, the main contributions we added is we basically fixed both of these problems by changing the architecture. And so to fix the problem with small objects, what we did is we cropped from earlier layers in the network, and then we combined them together. And then to fix, so basically what we're showing here is I'm cropping out of comp 5, but then also from earlier layers. So earlier layers in the network have higher resolution, but the problem is that the information in there is not as accurate if you try to use it for object detection. So earlier in the network, you can tell with higher resolution where is everything. You don't know what they are. And then later on, you know what objects are, but it's lower resolution, so you can't say where they are. And so by combining from these different layers, you can sort of get the best of both worlds, where you can use the earlier layers to help with localization, and the later layers to help with classification of what is the object. And so we concatenate all of them, and then we have the dimension reduction, and then the last few stages are the same as before. Yes?
Do you ask spatial dimension before you do the concatenation, or you just
So these are all the same dimensions because so I don't quite have time to explain exactly how we're able to do this, but these are all 6 by 6 in resolution. It's sort of a dynamic max pooling that will always give you a 6 by 6 size. So in fact, these are all the same shape. So you can in fact concatenate them along the depth axis. And so one other thing that you need to do is, because these are coming from different layers, there's no reason to believe that they should have the same amplitude. So in fact, one thing you also have to do is you have to do an L2 normalization before you concatenate them. And that's just one other note. So if you just to show what happens if you try to combine these layers without and with L2 normalization, if you tried this idea and didn't think about the amplitude problem, then you would actually get declining performance. And so here, higher is better. And so the blue bar is what happens if you just tried to do skip pooling from earlier layers. And this is possibly why people didn't try it earlier. But if you add in this L2 normalization, where you handle the fact that the amplitude might be different, then in fact you can see a benefit instead of degradation. And then Okay, so then finally, one other piece we add are these context features. And so these context features is basically one of the problems with this technique is that we don't know anything about what's outside the region of interest. If we want to understand, is this a person? The fact that they're sitting on a horse actually gives us positive evidence to think that there might be a person there. And so all of this information outside the box can somehow help us in our classification decision. And so these context features are basically a way of getting around that problem. And the way we obtain the context features is we have essentially a method that moves laterally along the image. And so we start from Conf5, and we take the features and we sort of share information laterally. And if we've done that, then we can crop out of this image. And then even though we're cropping out of this local region, it has information about what objects are anywhere in the image. So this is a little bit hand-wavy. I'll try and give you a little bit more intuition for what's happening here.
In overtime, so to go quick.
Okay. Maybe I should just skip over this.
Maybe.
Somehow we get context features. I don't have time to okay, one note is, so I mentioned the importance of all of these extra tricks and things. This was the winner. There's a method called residual networks, and they won the competition. And thankfully they gave a breakdown of what are all the different pieces they added and what was the performance. So the number that we got was 33.1 mean average precision. And one thing we did not do is we did not do multi-scale testing, and we did not use ensembling. And so this is their number if you remove those pieces. And so there's reason to believe that it's possible that if we had added in these extra pieces, then we may have had a chance of winning the competition. Who knows? So this was iron. So basically we had a new detector, and we also added in as many of the tricks as we could find, not enough, and then we did very well, and we presented it at CVPR. I'll very quickly describe, so what am I doing next? The visual style and recognition works very well. And it works so well that actually we're going to try and make a company out of it. And so here's a demo of our recognition system. And so here, for example, user indicates a box, and they say, so this picture I took in the lobby in New York City somewhere. And then here we're looking at different visually similar chairs. You can take this and project it back into the embedding, and then you can see scenes where this product has been used, and you can use this for inspiration. And so using this technique, sort of our vision is that you'll be able to buy anything in any photo. You'll be able to automatically recognize where are all the products and where can you buy them. You'll be able to design your room by saying, here's an interesting product. Give me the rest of the room that goes with it, by understanding how designers use this scene. And then you might also want to understand, here's the Eames chair, sort of an iconic chair in interior design. How are people using it, and what's the interest by country? And I'm out of time, so I'm going to go straight to the next slide. Any questions?
One question about the embedding that you were able to build, where you said that sort of there was this link organization in materials. So have you thought about how you could use that as a base model to go back to the material recognition task to make you do better than where you were starting?
That's very interesting. That's a very interesting idea. Yeah, I certainly think.
Sean, can you repeat the question?
I'm sorry, Kevin's question was the embedding that we learned appears to organize things by material as part of some of the dimensions. And so could you use that to inform material recognition? And I think the answer is definitely. I think that there's all of these tasks are sort of related, and you end up finding that when you solve one task, the other task gets sort of solved as a sub-problem inside the neural network. And so if you had sort of an ultimate scene understanding net that simultaneously tries to do object recognition, material recognition, fine-grained visual similarity, depth estimation, intrinsic images, then I think internally in the representation, it would be able to share this information between the tasks and probably do very well individually. I think it would be very interesting to try and build that sort of thing. One challenge is the data isn't there for that problem. So the data sets that we've collected for material recognition are on different images than the images people use for object detection, which is a mistake. We probably should have used the object detection data sets for material recognition.
So you're saying that if I give you a picture of that same bar stool, and instead I've given it like a titanium bar stool, and you would know you have this technique and no one else does, is it more likely that it's going to present you with metal bar schools, or just is there anything that you can say about what kind of thing will be, or is it more likely that it's just going to be saying it's a bar school?
From my intuitive understanding from looking at it is that it tends to organize things by sort of visual attributes. Like, for example, if there's like a green felt pillow, it might put it next to the green felt couch. And I think that's because it's sort of a view independence thing you can easily recognize from it as sort of a proxy for understanding what's the visual image. So my guess is that if it didn't know the object, but it could recognize that it was made out of metal, it might put it next to other metal things. I mean, it's very often it's hard to understand what these nets are doing, and many people are working on trying to understand and reconstruct, open the black box. And yesterday, Kevin had presented some methods for that. But we have not tried to open the box. I've just sort of studied what is the net appear to be doing.
So you mentioned this L2 normalization idea a couple of times.
Yes.
So does that involve doing some kind of PCA thing?
Oh, L2 normalization just means take all the vectors and then rescale them so they have unit norm. Just divide them by their length.
All vectors.
Yes, so if all vectors, it might be, basically, one of the things people have noticed is that if you're trying to do recognition or organization with vectors, it tends to be easier to predict their angle and not their absolute position. Meaning, like, what's the relative angle between two concepts in a vector space rather than what's the Euclidean distance. If you project everything to the hypersphere, then relative distance becomes the same as relative angle. And I'm sure there's something more principled mathematically you could say about the difficulty of predicting angle sources positions, but
So when you project things in these high-dimensional spaces, are there eigenvectors that are interesting, meaningful, or
eigenvectors?
You've got this high-dimensional.
Right.
You're saying it's all the normalized things?
Well, I mean, I think in order to have eigenvectors make sense, you would. I mean, it's not a linear transform, so I'm not sure if you could write down an eigenvector. So basically, yeah, I think there is a lot of work that could be done in terms of understanding what sort of the mathematical structure of these spaces, and sort of people. The first step is people are trying things to see if they work, and then they hand them off to the theory group and say, oh, how does this work? It seems to work. Does it always work? And so that work has not yet been done, I think. Well, one thing to note is that when you do project it down from the full space down to the unit hypersphere, you only lose one dimension. And so, in fact, you still have a fairly good representational power. And it just turns, so for example, if an object is uniformly brighter, then the activation throughout the network might be a little bit larger, but that doesn't mean the semantic concept has changed at all. And so by adding in these L2 normalization, and there's a related technique actually called batch normalization, where inside the network you say, I want it always to have zero mean and unit standard deviation. And so you're constantly editing the statistics inside the network to force it to have these properties. And so basically all of these tricks make the problem better numerically conditioned, and it turns out to work better.
Yeah, so I just want to say I really like your answer to that question.
Oh, thank you.
You're very good into it. It's really short.
Oh, thank you.
So I like that you focused on class balance much earlier on. And I had a question. So people have looked at the question of class balance versus imbalance, and there have been a bunch of things like whether the distribution in the data matches the distribution test, whether there's categories that are more important than others, like you don't want to miss a tumor, how to reweight examples in order to fake the class balance that you want, etc. And I was unclear what was the conclusion you had about balance.
So the intuition I have with balance is that even if the real world is unbalanced, if you train it that way, it won't have seen the rare events enough to be able to properly recognize them when they occur. So it turns out that it's often better to train in a balanced way, even like edit the training statistics to be different from the test set statistics, just so that way you know when it comes up to the rare events that you can do it properly.
But what if you had just weighted the rare classes more highly so that you
Right. That is what we do when we train. And so basically,
So, like the graph you had, that was actually what you were doing.
that was built in there, yes.
Okay.
That was more of an economics argument about how expensive is it to collect your training set. To say that because it turns out it's cheaper. If one challenge though is that if you're reweighting it and events are really rare, it may be very difficult. You may actually be throwing away a lot of data as you're collecting your data set, looking for that rare event, throwing away all the common events. And so it might be worth it even just to keep the common events, even though you have an unbalanced data set.
So another question related just about the unit computation side of things.
Mhm.
So we know that there are lots of ways that relying on crowdsourced labor can give you inaccurate results, which has implications for you both in terms of if the data were more inaccurate, you could be doing still with more accurate data. To the extent there's noise in the data, not just due to inter-subject disagreement, but because someone is just slacking off and randomly clicking. I mean, you have some protections in advance of this, but some people are more diligent than others. Some people, there's like a power law of mechanical workers where some people do a massive number of tasks. Those are people who tend to be less accurate than the people that are further down the tail. And so you've clearly done stuff to deal with accuracy of workers.
Yes.
And I'm kind of curious what you did, but I'm also curious if you thought about questions like asking a question, which of these is darker versus which of these is lighter, and all sorts of cognitive psychology results about ways of asking questions that can lead to biases.
That's true. That's a very good point. So certainly for the intrinsic images work, I think that there are many biases in the data. And so, for example, one bias that we observe, for example, is if you ask people for 2 points on a wood textured surface, which one is the darker surface reflectance? And basically they can't do it. They can only just say, yes, they look about the same. The problem is that the texture variations are too fine-grained and interesting that there's pretty much no way to get an answer from a person out of that. But they could say, for example, like a solid color object next to another solid color object, they're able to do it. And so those biases are currently baked into the data. And we're actually doing some follow-up work led by other Kavita students.
Milash was not here.
Who's not here, yeah. So it's follow-up work to try and undo these biases. And so we're doing some studies to first measure quantitatively what biases are people making, and then separately, can we undo them and then design a new metric that undoes it. To address the quality question, yes, quality is a huge challenge. And we have found that although maybe order of magnitude, a quarter to a third of people are not really trying that hard for some of these tasks. And if you just let them submit, they'll submit faster than everyone else, and you can end up with a majority data being cracked. And so what we've done is we've added in, we've asked multiple people, and then we stop asking answers from, we stop asking, people are giving us bad data, we ask them to stop labeling. And then also we have secret known answers. And so people, they might agree with each other in a way so they might be consistent with each other, but inconsistent with what we want. As we added a bunch of known answers, sentinels, and then make sure that they agree with us.
And if they don't match the sentinel, what do you do?
If we don't match the sentinel, then we block them. Well, we do a soft block to prevent them from communicating.
Any more questions, or do we move to phase 2? Good. All right. Well. So there will be champagne shortly in the lab, but we're going to continue to phase 2.
Okay.
I see an absence of forms.